In the middle of May, a freight train arrived at the tracks alongside the brick factory. My family gathered our belongings and joined the crowd heading for the boxcars. Nobody told us our destination, but we feared it would be Nazi-occupied Poland. My family struggled to keep together. We all managed to get into the same boxcar. For the sake of modesty, men moved to one side and women to the other side of the boxcar. A guard slammed the door shut and bolted it on the outside. Now it was dark in the train. A small slit in the top corner allowed some light to come in. Hours later, the train began to move. The only source of air was that small slit in the corner. There was a bucket for the toilet in the middle of the car. Hours passed, and a night and a day, the bucket filled up. Peering out the slit, my father confirmed everyone's worst fear. The train was crossing into Poland. Our knowledge of what was happening to Jews in other countries partly came from these Jewish families who were sent out deported because they were not citizens. And so some of them here and there would escape and come back, a single person. And they would tell stories about how in Nazi-occupied Poland, there were these people from all the other countries in Europe who were thrown out into the forests, literally there, plus the Polish people who were native, they were all being mowed down by Nazi gunfire. They just line them up and shoot people, and that's what was going on in Nazi-occupied Poland. And these people who came back and told us these stories, we didn't believe it. We did not believe it. We thought they're exaggerating. They had some trauma, they experienced something, but, so that was our knowledge of what's happening in Nazi-occupied countries. Not gas chambers, not crematoriums, not wholesale genocide, none of that. Finally, the train stopped. We are at some kind of a camp, my father announced. There are barracks here. This must be a work camp. Relief flooded over us. We were not going to be shot in the forest in Poland.
Most of the people on the train with Irene were unaware that extermination camps existed. They had no idea that they had just arrived at the most notorious of all Nazi death camps, Auschwitz-Birkenau. When Irene arrived in May of 1944, Auschwitz Nazis were murdering an average of 6,000 Jews a day, most of them within an hour of getting off the train.
There was a lot of shouting, leave everything behind, get out, fast. My mother quickly unpacked some clothing and told us to put on more layers. My head had already been shaved in the ghetto, so I was wearing a scarf on my head. I jumped out of the boxcar, down onto the platform. About 2,000 other people emptied onto the platform. My family reached for one another urgently, trying to stay together in the swarm of people, the noise and the confusion. As soon as we were out of the train, all of our possessions were dumped onto the platform and were loaded into trucks. A guard shouted, men to one side, women and children to the other. In an instant, my father and 16-year-old brother were lined up in a huge column of men off to one side. I would never see them again. My mother, sisters, younger brothers, and I were in another large column of women and young children. A chimney was visible in the distance. Flames and smoke billowed from it. The column edged forward. When we reached the front, a dozen or more armed Nazi soldiers blocked our way. One of them held a small stick. The one with a stick motioned my sister, Serena, who was 17, to one side. In the next moment, he motioned my mother and two little brothers to the other side. They disappeared from view. Only my younger sister and I remained. I was holding her hand. The baton came down between us, sending my sister towards where my mother went. The Nazi guard looked at me and hesitated for an instant. Although I was only 13 years old and would have been selected with the children, my kerchief on my head and a big coat that I was wearing confused him. He motioned me in the direction where my older sister went and turned his attention to women and children lined up behind me. I hesitated to leave, trying to see whether my younger sister had caught up with my mother. It was not possible for me to see what happened to her in the crowd. I was devastated to think that she would be alone in this crowd, and so I lingered there for a little while.
This photo was taken by Nazi soldiers at the time Irene arrived at Auschwitz. It captures the moment when Irene lingered looking for her sister. Children didn't normally wear scarves on their heads, but Irene was covering her shaved head with a scarf and wearing the extra layers her mother gave her. It made her look much older and had likely just saved her life. 13-year-olds like Irene were generally seen as too young for labor and were immediately sent to the unfit line. Men, women, and children in the unfit lines were marched immediately to the gas chambers to die.